All right, good morning, church. Today, we have to ask a question: what difference does it make what you believe? Does it make a difference what you believe? I'm going to show you a video, and I'll just be honest with you. Michael Mott and I have a difference of opinions on this. I find it horrifying. He finds it horrifyingly funny. You'll be on one of those. There's really no middle ground on this video. You'll find it either horrifying or you will be cracking up with the people in the video. So I want to show it to you. The background is that there is this kind of prank that families sometimes play on a member of their family where they sort of make that person think that they're invisible. All right, so see how it goes. They took a picture when she wasn't there and then showed it to her. So I actually cut the video. It goes on for another 45 seconds or so. I actually cut the video because she just starts shrieking. I mean, in utter, absolute terror at the situation that she has found herself in, because clearly she has become invisible. And everybody's acting like everybody's playing along. They can't see where she is. And they even literally took a picture a few seconds earlier of the other person on the couch. And then when she sat down, they showed it to her, and she still couldn't see herself. And so all of a sudden, she went from, this is just a fun birthday party, family time, to, I'm no longer here. And she starts she just collapses on the floor and starts sobbing. I mean, it gets to the point where I'm like, okay, at some point, Mom and Dad, you got to pull the plug on this, because it's gone way too, she's got trust issues and trauma for the rest of her life because of that moment. But y'all, our behaviors are inherently tied to what we believe about reality. You can see that in this video. As soon as she believed that she was invisible, she saw something she thought of as proof, it changed her whole outlook on her existence. Everything changed for her. So the goal for humans should be to match our beliefs to what we could call the real, to what actually is occurring in our world. And when we do that, we achieve a kind of unity that allows for a healthy psyche, a well-developed internal world. But when we hold views that do not accord with reality, we act in harmful and dangerous ways. If you held the belief that gravity had no effect on you and you really got convinced of it, you would act in ways that were harmful for you. And if you believed somehow through some course of events that your skin has become too tough for a knife to bite into, you would not be careful when you were slicing tomatoes, and you would hurt yourself. The things that we believe matter. If you believe there's no God and no afterlife, it has massive implications on the way that you live your life, your actions, your identity. All of these things come from those core beliefs. Conversely, if you do believe that there's a God, that belief drives your goals. It drives what you're going to be about, and a lot of it depends on what kind of God you believe in. So today we're going to be looking at how the Christian worldview made a difference in early Rome. What you believe matters. Let me just give you a quick recap in case you weren't here last week. Last week we established that our culture is kind of in a mess. I don't know that you needed to be here to actually get on the boat with that our culture is in a mess, but we talked about how a very wholesome TV show like Bluey is under attack by New York Times columnists because the dad is so awesome. He's a really good dad. And it gets attacked because that's going to make some people feel left out because they don't have that kind of dad or they're not that kind of dad. The soft bigotry of low expectations, George W. Bush called that. And when we talked about how medical assistance in dying, the conversation is about your right to die, but it inevitably turns to your duty to die when you're not useful to your society anymore. And that's the move that we're seeing, especially in Canada right now. And then our culture's embrace of policies for gender dysphoria that actually amount to child abuse. We're enshrining in law child abuse because of the ways, the policies that are developed to treat gender dysphoria as just a normal outworking of human existence. They encourage this detachment from the real, the actual reality. And so there's a serious quandary in our culture about what is good and what is true and what is right. And so we decided we're going to be going through this class about worldviews from first century Rome until now. And you should maybe last week have been thinking to yourself, we've been through a lot of history classes lately. Danny took us through the early church fathers. Curtis Bostic has taken us several different times through different periods of Israel's history, the intertestamental period. And lately it seems like we've been doing a lot of history classes. And I think it's a good question. I think you should kind of look and think critically about what you're hearing in your local church. I think that's a healthy question to ask. So I think it's good for us to say at Charleston Bible, we do want to bring a balance. Our Sunday school classes will go from, exegetical, expository teaching about a passage of Scripture or a book. Sometimes we'll pick up certain topics as they become timely. We ran a class a while back about grace relations, which was about really race relations and what Christian perspective should be in that area. We talk about basic theology. We'll do systematic theology occasionally. But y'all, we are not shying away from these kind of history-centered classes because Christianity is distinctly rooted in history. It is a historical faith. The historical reality of the Old Testament and the New Testament are central to what we believe and the way that we live our lives. And Christ followers have left their footprints in history. Followers of the way have made an impact in history. And I think it's going to be good for us to know how to deal with our culture today. It is going to be so helpful for us to look backwards and see how have Christians in the past dealt with their culture, which the further we get into it, the more you're going to realize not that much changes. We look at our culture today and we go, man, it's never been this bad. Trust me, it's been this bad. We'll see that as we continue going on. So our goals for this class, I just want to put these in front of you on a regular basis so that we keep in mind how can we know if we're succeeding in teaching and in listening in this class. We want to better understand the development of Western thought from 1st century to 21st century to know how we've arrived here and kind of the steps along the way. We want to succinctly explain what a worldview is. I think we knocked that out of the park last time. Michael asked that question, opened it up for discussion, and it was just like here, 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 here. Everybody was like, we know what a worldview is. We can talk about it in the right kind of terms, and that's very encouraging. We want to be able to evaluate worldviews from a biblical perspective, to be able to look at what worldview ideas are being pushed at us in different ways and be able to really take them apart and say, underneath what I'm watching in TV or in the movies or I'm reading in these books, underneath that are these worldview assumptions. And I need to be able to see those and evaluate them. And then lastly, as we kind of turn towards the end of the class, those last couple of sessions, we want to look specifically and directly at our culture and say, where are the things that are broken that Christians can step in and fix? Where are the gaps? Where are things missing in our culture that Christians can stand in that space and provide a redeeming moment in our culture? So that's where we want to aim this class. As far as resources that we're using, the Colson Fellows Program by Chuck Colson and the Colson Center for Christian Worldview is going to be a big part of this. This book, Why You Think the Way You Do by Glenn Sunshine. And then you'll hear me pulling from the Breakpoint podcast regularly, and that's worth subscribing to. It's a 5 to 7 minutes of your day, and it's worth your time if you want to start thinking. I'm going to say a word that sounds weird. If you want to start thinking worldviewishly, then this is a good resource for you. So last week we said, what is a worldview, and what was the prevailing worldview of Rome? We'll recap that really quickly, and today we're going to talk about what impact did Christians have in that culture. That is exciting to look at. So just to briefly remind you, life in Rome in the first couple of centuries after the birth of Christ looked like this. People were at the mercy, in their minds, their worldviews, they were at the mercy of impersonal gods whom they needed to appease, and they were also required to worship the emperor. There was incense burnt to the emperor on a regular basis, and that was part of their requirement in Rome. People were stuck in a social hierarchy that held women and enslaved people and children as nearly valueless. Nearly valueless. It doesn't really matter what you do with them, how you interact with them. If you inflict pain, it doesn't really, they're hardly people. That was the worldview. People at the top of the social hierarchy had all the moral authority. They could decide what was right and wrong and carry it out. There was reckless abandon to sensual pleasures, especially in the upper classes. Y'all, one of the emperors, Caligula, is notable in the history of the world as an emperor who had his, sometimes movie studios will make biographies about different people. When they set out to make a biography of Caligula, it was Penthouse magazine that directed the film. And if you don't know, that's a pornographic magazine. So it tells you something about Caligula and about the lavish give over to sensual pleasures in the upper classes in Rome. Abortion and infanticide were common, expected, and then even mandated in some areas by law. If a father saw that his child was born malformed, by law, there was a requirement to leave it out in the woods to die of exposure so that they would not weaken the Roman culture. So that's the culture that Christians were born into. And all of that comes from worldview questions. What is good? What is right? What should the purpose of life be? The way that they answered those questions changed everything about their culture. So to know how the Christian worldview impacted Roman culture, there is one major idea that needs to be understood. It's the most fundamental difference between Christian faith and anything else that has come before or after. Michael's going to come and tell us a little bit about this idea of Imago Dei. You probably know that terminology and that phrase, but maybe haven't thought about its origin or really contemplated all of its implications. And so Michael's going to help us out with that topic.
All right, well, last week we talked about how one small idea can have a huge impact on your worldview. And Donnie, you weren't here, but we actually showed a red oak leaf. Okay. Missed it, and Clayton had to answer all the questions about leaves, so put him on the spot. But really the difference was idealism. Is there some spirit leaf in the sky that shadows itself across all these leaves, and that's how we can know what a leaf is, whether it's a white oak or a red oak or palm leaf? Or do we just see all these different leaves and somehow our mind can abstract what it means to be a leaf because we see some commonalities there? And that small difference where you think, well, how could that have any type of practical influence on my outlook? It did. And so today we're going to talk about another one of those. And Jonathan already said it, it's the Imago Dei, or the image of God. Our primary text for this comes from Genesis 1. It says, then God said, let us make man in our image, according to our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the sky, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female, he created them. All right, so we have some questions maybe about who this us is. Let us make man in our own image. Is that the Trinity? Is that all the angels that are there? There's a debate about that. That's not the important thing. But what is important is the role that man is given. What does it mean for man to be created in the image of God? The very next thing that we're told is that man is going to rule over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the sky. And I think it's also too important for us to point out that this is man and female. Male and female are both created in the image of God. There's no distinction there. I think sometimes in the past we have tried to make that distinction. We said that Rome, the free citizen males were right below God, maybe even considered as God. In Christianity, we're going to say no. Man, woman, you are created in the image of God. You are created to rule together. And then we also might ask, what does it mean to be in the image of God? Is it just the fact that we have a soul? Well, let's look at these verses. Just before, in verses 20, then God said, let the waters teem with the swarms of living creatures. You see I have that bolded and underlined. We'll come back to that. And let birds fly above the earth in the open expanses of the heaven. God created the great sea monsters and every living creature that moves, with which the waters swarmed after their kind, and every winged bird after its kind. And God saw that it was good. We see lots of examples of very intelligent animals out there. And in fact, the Hebrew word that I have that kind of is behind these word creatures is the Hebrew word nephesh, and it means soul-ish thing, okay? So animals do have a soul. They have a non-physical self. They have emotions, intelligence, and wills. But is their soul made like ours? No, it's a different type of soul. In fact, our word for animal comes from the root to animate, the idea that there is something inside this physical shell that is animating it or soul. So we wouldn't want to argue with someone that we're made in the image of God just because we have a non-physical self. Animals have a non-physical self. But what separates us from the animals? Well, philosophers have tried to figure this out. Some of them have said, well, it's our rationality and our reason. So some philosophers like Thomas Aquinas argue that humans' capacity for rational thought and moral reasoning reflect the divine intellect. Unlike animals, humans can engage in abstract thinking, self-reflection, and complex problem solving. Also, we are moral agents. So philosophers would pick up on this. We don't ever look at a lion who comes in, takes over a pride, kills all the cubs from a different lion, and then forces the pride into heat so that he can now make a whole bunch of his own cubs. We don't go, wow, what an evil lion that is. That's how animals work. We don't have moral expectation of those animals. We have moral expectations of us. There's a difference between us. Also, the level of consciousness and self-awareness. Also, just by observation, when we look around, we can see humans are kind of unique here, right? People try to argue that. People would argue that there's no difference between a human and a cockroach. I think those guys are crazy. That's the technical term. We have a capacity for altruism and love. We can self-sacrifice ourselves. There's a Marine that is well known, and he sees this grenade. He puts his helmet over the grenade and lays over it, sacrificing himself for his brothers. We don't see that type of behavior typically among the humans, among other animals. And then we have the stewardship for creation. So no matter where your worldview is, we all think that humans somehow should be helping to take care of what we're given here. We should protect animals that are in danger. We should not pollute the environment. Do we think that cows should do that? Do we think, you should be picking up trash, chimpanzee? No, we don't have those types of ideas. So just from our simple observation, we can see that there is a difference. But I think our best source of information between what makes us have the image of God and others not is Scripture. So we're going to look at it, just a few scriptures, and I'll turn it back over to Jonathan. So in Psalm 8, we see, we're going to pick up at verse 3. When I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars, so you knew we had to go here, which you have ordained, what is man that you take thought of him, and the Son of Man that you care for him? Yet you have made him a little lower than God, and you crown him with the glory and majesty. Some of those translations will say a little lower than the angels. You made him rule over the works of your hands. You put all things under his feet, all sheep and oxen, and also the beasts of the field, the birds of the heavens, and the fish of the sea, whatever passes through the paths of the sea. So again, I'd say the resounding thing here is we see this hierarchy. We have God, some translations are going to say angels. Then right underneath that, we have man. So maybe the Romans had some type of sense of what was going on, but it wasn't exactly right. But then we see this idea of ruling again. That is a big deal. We are supposed to rule. What does that mean? In Ecclesiastes 3, it says, he has made everything appropriate in its time. He has also set eternity in their heart, yet so that man will not find out what the work of God has done from the beginning even to end. So we kind of just pull this out of context. The main thing is that there is some sense in which man has this mind, this view of eternity. Other animals who are soulish, I don't think they ask, what happens when I die? Will grandmother survive this summer? There's no animals asking those types of questions. We ask those types of questions. Do I have a soul? Do I go on? There's a difference. There's a self-awareness of what happens between us. Ephesians 4 and put on the new self, which in the likeness of God has been created in the righteousness and holiness of the truth. So we have this likeness of God that's been put in us. If you were following along in your Bible, you would see that the likeness of is in italics. So scholars, what's that mean? If it's in italics in the NASB at least. Yeah, it's implied. It's not really there in the original translation. The translators have put this in there to help read it, but the word kata is there, which means according to. So I don't know why this is in italics, because it's probably the best way to translate that. But Paul, the point here is Paul is recognizing that we need to, as believers, put on the new self and become closer, perhaps, to the image of God that we were designed to be as we work through righteousness and truth. We have moral obligations that we are to fill out. Colossians 3, again, Paul, again talking about putting on the new self, have put on the new self who is being renewed to a true knowledge according to the image of the one who created him. So we're supposed to have a true knowledge of him. We're supposed to walk in a way that honors him. So here's my summary of what I think it means to have the image of God. And I think the biggest thing is that we have an office that we are to rule. We are to be, God's managers of this creation, ambassadors of him to this world. And in order to do that, God has given us certain faculties: intelligence, emotions, a will or volition. We are self-aware. We're rational. We are moral agents, but not only moral agents, we're expected to be righteous moral agents, right? And we have a knowledge of who God is so that we can carry out those things. So now the small idea of who we are, what our role is here on this earth, and how we're to interact with others and our earth, we're supposed to steward our earth, can have a huge difference in how we interact with folks. So again, one small idea can have huge impacts. So we're going to look at the rest of this lesson, and really the rest of this course, is how does that idea of us being made in the image of God affect early Christ followers, and then how does that help them affect their culture? Jonathan.
It would be difficult for us to fully understand just how radical Judaism and its full realization in Christianity were to a pagan world. Everything that you just heard Michael talk about with this Imago Dei, that concept would have been just radical to a pagan world. So I do want us to look at some of the basic differences just between pagan culture and Christian culture in this, maybe the first 3 centuries or so after Christ's birth. That's the time period we're kind of locked into right now as Rome is an empire. And I want to point out some differences, and then we'll kind of end up landing on that Imago Dei and all of the implications that had for the Christians living in this time. So let's talk about this first, the Christian view versus the pagan view. First of all, it's the gods versus the God. That's going to be one of the primary differences between these groups. In most pagan religions, the many gods that emanated from the one God, the one universal kind of soul, were basically humans with extra powers. That's a bad thing for humans to have these extra powers. Now, we watch superhero movies, right? And a lot of times, these superheroes are just great, and they're helping the world against evil. But if your average person got superpowers, imagine what the world would look like. It's not all altruism out there when somebody gets superpowers. And that's what these gods basically were. They were petty and they were vengeful, themselves creations of more significant powers. And morality for these pagan religions was not a religious, it was a philosophical concept, but it was not something that was seated in their religious experience. The idea of virtue and morality, because the gods themselves were not virtuous. They did not contain the kind of virtues that you would aspire to. Judaism and then Christianity's radical monotheism was distasteful to this culture. What is the only sin in a pluralistic culture. The only thing, like you can think about today, in our culture, what is the only thing that you really can get in trouble for believing in the plurality of worldviews that exist in the West? The one unforgivable sin is exclusivity. To say it's just one thing. It's not all those things, it's just one thing that is true. And that's what the Jews and the Christians did. They said, all of those other things are not true. This one thing is true, this one God. And that was very distasteful to a culture that basically, as they expanded, as the Roman Empire expanded, like, oh, you guys have this kind of God for agriculture? Yeah, bring them along. It's a party. We had all the gods over here. Everybody's hanging out. Like, bring everybody, do the sacrifices to whoever you need to kind of, your personal family gods, your regional gods. Just bring them all in. Make sure you burn some incense to the emperor because he's God on earth. But other than that, like, you do you. And the Christians and the Jews said, it can't be that. It can't be that. But what was more significant was that this one God of the Jews and Christians was a couple of characteristics that did not apply in pagan religions. This God, this one God of the Jews and the Christians, was non-contingent. So he wasn't created. He wasn't dependent on something. He didn't emanate from something else. He was himself the author of being. He was himself the standard of morality. They didn't look at the Roman gods and look at them for morals. But the Jews looked at Yahweh and said, this is righteous. This is true. And this God was personal. That is a defining characteristic of the Christian God. He's personal. He interacts in history. Another thing that was a difference, and this is more a difference between Judaism and Christianity, as we start moving into the development of Christians in this first century, there's this idea of the status quo versus expansion. You know, Rome had offered Judaism kind of a get-out-of-jail-free card. They didn't have to worship the emperor. And the reason for that is they didn't really ruffle feathers. Judaism, the Jews of this time, did not see themselves as having some kind of mandate to convert the world to Judaism. That was not part of their worldview. Their worldview is we are the few, we are the chosen, and we hang tight. We try not to even mess with the Gentiles. We got to do business with them sometimes, but we try not to really mess with them. We just stay tight. It's us. It's always been us. It's always going to be us. And so there wasn't this huge, Jewish proselytizing all over ancient Rome. It wasn't them going out trying to convert people and take them away from emperor worship and all this stuff. Rome was pretty comfortable, except for a few, outcroppings of zealots every so often would pop up and try to throw off the Roman government. For the most part, Rome was cool with the Jews because they really didn't ruffle feathers. Well, what about Christians? Christians had a clear mandate to go into the world, to preach the gospel, to disciple. And then here's the problem for the empire. Most of the people who converted to Christianity were Gentiles. So they didn't get the little umbrella of we're Jewish and so we don't have to worship the emperor. Christians were actively pulling people out of pagan culture, out of emperor worship, and saying there's one God and you worship him and him alone. And there is a problem for Rome. This is treason. And so these early Christians began to experience some persecution. Sometimes jail and imprisonment, sometimes torture. Sometimes it was very harsh. Sometimes they were just an unpopular minority. They were just that weird fraction group over there. But Christians had a mandate to expand the kingdom. And that was a problem in Rome, and that led to some of their persecution. Another difference between Christians and the pagan culture that they were surrounded with was sexual ethics. Although early Christians were mistaken, you guys know this sometimes from your biblical history, early Christians were mistaken and accused of holding orgies. They called them love feasts. And the pagan world was like, we know what that is. We know what's going on over there. Love feast, sure, okay. But the Jewish and then the Christian sexual ethic was revolutionary in a pagan world. In this ethic, sex was reserved for marriage. Homosexual behavior was condemned. Incest was made anathema. You can see that in Paul's letters. He even addresses some of these things. In the church, he goes, hey, remember what you've been called to. We're not living like that anymore. And to a world that was simply awash in sexual revelry, this way was different, and it was distasteful for those who were in power, because they were the ones enjoying all of that kind of lavish sexuality. But listen to this. For the powerless, for women, for children, for slaves, think of what this way meant. Think of the revolution in families. When a father realized these people do not exist for my pleasure, they exist as the likeness of God. And they're to be honored and respected in the likeness of God. Imagine the impact that has on families, and especially for those at the bottom of that totem pole, the powerless. You know, the Christians, for the most part of history, have been the poor and the powerless. And this equalizing idea of the Imago Dei is the thing that draws the powerless and the meek and the poor of this world to this faith. This was a blessed redemption of the bodies of the powerless. So now we can talk about these competing ideas of human value. This is what Michael was talking about, and it works out talking from sexual ethics into this idea of Imago Dei. The point at which every distinctive quality of the early Christian culture converges is at that point of being made in the image of God. That is the fundamental difference. That's the thing that matters most for this early church. There are a couple of ways that different cultures have tried to assign value to people over the years. If you can think through some civilizations, think through some ways that people have been valued. Think of today. What is your value in this culture? What is it based on? So a couple of ways. One way that value has been assigned to people in the history is by utility. This is a big one. Are you useful? Many cultures have believed your value is rooted in what you can offer to the society, what you can bring. And so that meant that the most valuable people were generally, well, able-bodied men who could work hard and make the economy go. So is value based on utility, how useful you are? There was another idea of where you could get value, and that was from nobility. That Neoplatonic hierarchy of being, where the closer you are to the one, the more valuable you are. That was very common in ancient cultures as well. But this Imago Dei, y'all, it's impossible to overstate how significant it was, how significant it is. It's the foundation of everything that is great in Western civilization. If we want to talk about how worldviews have changed over the years, this thing made more of a difference than anything else. In this view, the value of a human is attached to the personal God that created that human mirrors in these different ways that Michael talked about. And the fact that God invites humans into the work of Adam in the garden, into the creation mandate, into subduing and filling the earth, to excel in industry and in science and in education, to be representatives of that God in this universe, that's radical to a pagan culture that was looking at you like, what can you offer? Because every human bears the image of this maker. Every human is equal in spiritual value, regardless. Listen to what brought people into Christianity. Your value is the same, regardless of birth or blood or fitness or position throughout life or anything else that humans have used to assign value. Imago Dei makes the difference. Because of this idea of inherent value, listen to what Christians did in this culture. This is what transformed the culture. Christians did not participate in the games as spectators, as entertainment. You know, the Colosseum, the Christians, that was anathema to them. They said, we're not going to engage in that. Now, unfortunately, they were forced to engage in that as participants at different times of their persecution in that early Roman Empire. But the bloodlust of the Colosseum had no place in the Christian worldview. Because these are all image bearers. Every single person that was in that Colosseum, from slaves to gladiators to everyone else, they're made in the image of God. And so Christians said, that's not for us. That's not going to be our idea. The Christians rescued infants, mostly girls, abandoned to die by exposure. Y'all, that was like part of their cultural movement. They would have people that their kind of role in daily life was to go out and kind of comb through the forest on the outskirts of the city and find babies and bring them and nurse them into health. You remember that in Rome, one daughter was fine, but more than that, and you were just going to dispose of her. This led to an interesting demographic in the early church, in the early Christian communities. In the general Roman population, first couple of centuries after Christ, there were 130 to 140 men for every 100 women in that culture. All right, so there's an imbalance of genders, but Christian communities had much more of a balanced ratio because as those girls grew up, there were more of them in that Christian community, in that Christian worldview. And it's interesting, there was an evangelistic effect. When all of these girls that had been raised from babies grew up in a Christian worldview and they started looking around for husbands, some of them would marry in the community of faith, but some of them would marry into culture and kind of drag husbands into the church. And so there was a redeeming effect on culture by the fact that Christians, now remember, small idea, big effect. Imago Dei. Those babies are worth saving. And all of a sudden, the redemptive part of that experience in culture was, well, now there are Christian young women going out, getting married, and bringing people into the church. And then they're having more babies, and they're bringing more people into the church. And the movement grew as a result of their conception of Imago Dei. In a culture where women were devalued, Aristotle said they were just half-baked men. They didn't make it all the way in the gestation period, and so they didn't have all the parts that you're supposed to have, so they're like just halfway to maleness, which is very offensive. He basically said the dough just didn't rise all the way, and so we got women. And you're like, all right, Aristotle. Women in communities of Christ followers found honor and value, and they found roles where they could serve as deaconesses in the church, as mentors to other women. Some wealthy women even hosted house churches. Like this is the Christian movement. Because of Imago Dei, this redemptive factor of their culture. Another thing that Christians did is they systematically opposed slavery, even raising money to buy slaves at auction and free them. So they're filling the ranks of Christianity in the early centuries with the poor and the powerless, freed slaves, women that had been abandoned as babies and grew up in the church. The lowest of the low in this culture having equal value before God. They had a redeeming effect on their culture. In the 300s, all right, so we're fast forwarding just a bit. We'll talk about this time period next week. But in the 300s, there was an emperor named Julian who tried to undo what Constantine did. In 313, Emperor Constantine legalized Christianity and actually kind of made it sort of state-sponsored. Like, okay, so now we're kind of turning toward Christianity as a culture. Well, after him, Julian, he's called Julian the Apostate. He tried to bring Rome back to its pagan roots. But during a famine, even he had to admit this. These impious Galileans, he's talking about Christians because they originated from that region of Galilee. Impious, meaning what? They don't worship the emperor. They don't worship the gods. These impious Galileans support not only their poor, but ours as well. And he was upset about it. They look really good because they're taking care of everybody, not just their poor. And when plagues swept the empire, Dionysius of Alexandria recorded that Christians were the ones visiting plague houses. After the doctors had gone, I'm not going back there. Do you see what that guy's got? I'm not going back. The Christians went, ministered, and died with plague victims. And they considered it an honor to do that. Imagine the effect on culture. And you know, actually, the survival rate from those plagues changed dramatically because it turns out a little bit of care in some of those diseases makes all the difference between life and death. A little bit of water, a little bit of broth makes all the difference in your body's ability to kind of do what it's trying to do and fight off an infection. And so they redeemed that aspect of their culture. When the doctors who were supposed to serve people were going, I'm out, the Christians said, tag me in. I'm there. I like reading what secular historians say about Christians of this period because they can't deny what impact Christians had on this culture. So listen to two of them. Darrell Amundsen, he's a professor emeritus of classics at Western Washington University. It's a secular university. He said this: the strongly held idea that human value is acquired rather than inherent was nearly pervasive in classical antiquity. So you follow him with, he's saying the idea that you have to earn some kind of value as a human, that was pervasive in